We're glad to have you here in the deep of the South to learn more about not just civil rights, but human rights. And as I travel around the world today, going 20, 30 countries a year in very difficult places, be it Syria or Sudan or Yemen, Libya, every continent on the face of the earth, these are unsettled times. And while we don't live in the past, we must learn from the past. I grew up in a little small town about 45 miles from here called Lamar. My mother was a school teacher. My family was a big supporter of the public school system during a time period where racial integration reached some of the most difficult times in American history, particularly in the 20th century. Lamar High School was where it was one of the first forced publicly integrated schools in America. My mother was a teacher, and I was at a 99% white public school, and across the town, so to speak, was the 99% African-American school. Well, forced racial integration, most all the whites fled our school and started these little private schools, and overnight, I was at a 99% African-American school, with my mother and my father saying, we will not abandon the schools. Some of the greatest friendships and relationships that I've ever had. And our house was about a block or two from the school. So a lot of the athletes, my brothers and all of us were in sports. Well, a lot of the kids, they couldn't catch the bus home and then come back for practice. So they all come down to our house. So we grew up together. All of us, black and white, didn't matter. But I was amazed at how ordinary citizens that would appear to be God-fearing, good people can so amazingly quick change character. I've seen it in Kosovo. I've seen it in Sudan, where people who live across the street from one another, that would appear to be on the surface friends, but when ethnic differences and racial divisions and religious conflict take place, they'll choose sides and turn on one another. I was beyond my father's imagination that anything like what I would see in Kosovo could happen here, only to realize that it can happen here so quickly if we don't stamp out prejudices of every nature as quickly as possibly can. And while we don't want to be the thought police, we do want to help train and raise our children up, like the mayor said, what you doing to the least of these, you're doing to me. That golden rule of doing to others, you'll have them doing to you. As I travel around the world, doesn't matter where I'm meeting with an atheist or a Hindu or a Buddhist, a Protestant, a Catholic, a Muslim, a Shia, Sunni. That golden rule applies in every culture in the world. That teaching of Jesus, whether you see him as a man, a prophet, or a savior, is a rule that should be applied in every ethnic culture, in every neighborhood in the world. So when I was governor elected, I served in the House of Representatives for 14 years, most of which was a Democrat. My last year was a Republican. I ran for governor as a Republican. And I was elected in 1994, and I can tell you the greatest years of my life was in the legislature, working with the friends there, Democrat, Republican. It really was amazing back then, Tom. D's and R's got along pretty good. We might have voted a little bit differently here and there, IS and I served together from the late 70s to the 80s. But it never was vitriolic. It never was personal. But today, it's amazing the extraordinary division that takes place. I'm on the Hill almost every week in the United States Congress, the Senate and the House. And privately, these men and women are heartbroken. Leaders all over the world that will privately meet with you, prime ministers and presidents of every culture, every race, every sex, too, every political dynamic background you can imagine, are heartbroken because they don't know what to do. They realize that man's ways aren't working. And we began to talk about loving your neighbor and loving one another. The golden rule. And you can tell their heart is like yearning for the simplicity of love and unity for one another. And it's up to us, we the people, to stand for these types of values regardless of the laws in Washington. Regardless of what our Constitution says, we should rise to a higher standard in teaching our children. So when I was elected governor, we were passing many different types of legislation, trying to change the state. One of the issues that we were confronted with was the Confederate flag. Well, it seems to be a harmless thing. It was the third flag on our Capitol dome. It wasn't the state official flag. And at the time period, as me had asked me to talk about some of the practical dynamics of what was taking place, most people don't recall. But it was an amazing time in America. At that point in time, it seemed to be quite tense. We had shutdowns in government, had a Republican-controlled House and Senate. We were fighting with regards to block grants, Medicaid, welfare reform, and the list goes on, and there was a shutdown. Of course, the media was hammering Bob Dole, now they love him, and Newt Gingrich at the time. There were 32 Republican governors out of the 50. In the South, what was taking place along the same time period, which was creating an interesting public dynamic here, was church burnings, primarily in the South. African-American churches being burned. There were a few isolated racial incidents with like a white cop and an African-American citizen on I-95, or a few isolated places around the South, all in the midst of this taking place. And then we had this opening of this KKK museum in Lawrence or Clinton area of the state. I can't remember exactly which town. I think it was Lawrence. And a few other things. At the same time, we were negotiating with companies like BMW and Michelin, because South Carolina was changing the economy from an economy that had been agrarian-based and textile-based and a lot of military installations to an economy that was going to be diversified. And we felt it was time for us to move forward. With all these things taking place, and knowing that we had a population, a substantial part of our population, that felt like the flag didn't represent them. And our view, with all these things taking place, that maybe it's time to lay it all on the line and resolve that issue. Now, the interesting thing was all my political advisors saying, look, you're the Republican governor. You don't need to take the lead on this issue. And in fact, why don't you wait till after your reelection? My poll numbers were out of the roof. Things were great. No way anyone could beat me. Wait till after the election. They were, Governor, it's the right thing to do, but should we wait? And I said, no, we shouldn't wait. And so we began assembling a team of D's and R's, black and white, all walks of life. And it's amazing what happened. The vitriolic personal attacks, I can't even begin to tell you the number of attacks on me, of which they weren't all personal. I mean, they weren't all spiritual, and they weren't all just by the voice. There was an extraordinary intensity out there. Threats on the family. I didn't mind threats on me, but it was threats on the kids and your wife, and you just can't believe these kind of things would happen. How could this happen in the end of the 20th century? Haven't we gone beyond this? Good people. And again, it was a reminder that human rights and civil rights shall always be a vigilant part of our watch on a day-to-day basis, no matter where you are in the world. And if it can happen here, my goodness, then it can happen, of course, anywhere. And we should be the beacon of light to the rest of the world, how to do it and how to do it right. Even if we have our differences. And this is one of the things that I talk with my colleagues in the U.S. Senate, U.S. House, and countries all around the world. When we stand for what you believe in, do it with honor and love and compassion, no matter how different you may be. Love your enemy, love one another. That doesn't mean you vote together. I could tell you stories after stories of how I've seen men and women who hated each other just by sitting them down in the same room without press, without staff, and let them just shake their hand and have just a discussion. men and women that you would be amazed that have become friends just by the mere fact of sitting down and talking things through. We want to talk it through the press sometimes, and it gets more vitriolic. But that's not the way we should be doing things. We need to sit down and work through things. Well, the flag was a controversial issue, as you can imagine. I was quite shocked to some degree, but it is and was what it was. The flag had its course in the debate for a good year or so. I was defeated. A friend of mine, Zell Miller from Georgia, we were in Tokyo before I went public with this. I said, Zell, I'm thinking about taking the flag down. And Zell's great governor, senator, just a good guy. Marine, served his country, paid a price for America's freedom, and so he knew what sacrifice was all about, and he knew the politics, and he looked at me, put his arm around me. He was about 20 years older than me. I was 30-something years old. He said, son, you need to think long and hard about that. And we chuckled a little bit, and I said, no, this is the right thing to do. And he says, well, you go have a lesson. And he meant that in the most wonderful way. He just knew how people can surprise you. And so election night, I'll never forget, we had lost, which everybody said it couldn't happen. And no, by the way, I had 2 phone calls from national leaders in the United States, and I knew both these figures fairly well in different ways. And at the time, I was at the White House with President Clinton, who'd been a friend, and working on Race Relations Commission. But there were 2 people that were calling, and whenever they see me, would say, "How's it going down there? I know you're catching heat." One was Hillary Clinton. She would go out of her way to come by and say, "Hey, what can we do to help? What can I do to help?" The other was George Bush. It was the George that was more my age, not the dad. And George called me on the phone and said, "I know you catching it over there." I'm like, "You have no idea." And I can remember times when some of the Tom friends would call and say, "Oh, we're with you 100%. We're with you 100%. Privately. And you know, when it's time to walk out onto the battlefield and take the shots, you couldn't find them. And they weren't all Republicans. There were Democrats and Republicans. They were heading for the hills, hiding behind the mounds, not wanting to get down and dirty and be willing to lose something. But if you're not willing to risk something, chances are, if nothing's being risked, you probably aren't really doing anything. Well, I remember that night I asked my staff, I said, "Let me ask you 3 questions. Did we do what was right?" They said, "Yes." I said, "Did we do what was right when it was right to do it?" They said, "Unfortunately, yes." I said, "Third question, and this is probably as important as the other 2. When you do what's right at the right time, did we do it the right way? Did you do it in love and compassion, or did you do it in bitterness and condemnation?" I have found that I've really never, ever won anybody over that was on the opposite side by telling them how wrong they are and how bad they are. You know, right really doesn't win the day by saying how wrong you are. Right is just right. And standing up for the positive and the good has a better way. But there are times when you've got to be very clear in condemnation of what's wrong and what's evil. But you don't necessarily have to attack the person's character. We need to rise above that, because it's extremely effective to those observing. I was speaking up in Detroit a few weeks ago with all the mayors of that region, and I said, you know, we got all the wealth we need in Detroit, but yet we got more poverty. Same thing in Washington, D.C. and any other big city. I said, we got more government programs and we got more brokenness and loneliness and prisons and crime. I said, we got more religion you can shake a stick at. The Baptists don't talk to the Catholics, and the Protestants don't talk to the Orthodox. And I said, so I don't need the church come tell me about unity in politics when the church itself has got more division in politics. I said, but while we have this division, why don't we, Democrats and Republicans, walk the streets together and say, you know, we might have our differences on the Hill. We might have our differences on City Hall. But we believe in you, the American people. Why don't we come together and united in loving others? Yes, even loving our enemy, following the golden rule. I asked a couple of D's and R's that you would know on the national level, very respected and very powerful men and women. We were talking about the presidential campaign last year before the election. And at the end, I said, let me ask y'all something. I said, you Democrats, if you could pass everything you wanted and control the House and the Senate and the White House and pass it just like you wanted and execute the policies just like you wanted, how much difference do you really honestly think it would make in America today? And though I know you think it'd be important. And I said, but the same question, you Republicans. If you could pass and control the House and the Senate and the White House and everything like you wanted, how much difference do you really think it would make in America today, though we know and believe in the importance of law? Nobody has fought harder and probably proposed more laws and written more laws and signed more laws than me. So I believe in this. I said, but truthfully, or option 3? They said, option 3? I said, yeah. What if we just asked the American people, just for 60 days, to try out this little experiment? Just for 60 days, regardless of your political party, religious affiliation, denomination, sex, color of your skin, your wealth, the doing to others, you would have them doing to you, the golden rule, just for 60 days. Which of these 3 do you think would make a bigger impact in our nation? And every one of them, hands down, says, well, Governor, you know the answer to that. I said, then while we continue to bicker on these policies in Washington, why don't we set the example and do that in the streets and the heartbeat of America? From Washington to Camden to Detroit to L.A. to Chicago, all across our land. That's the civil rights that must be manifested within our hearts on a day-to-day basis. While we bicker about the laws, and I do believe the laws, as you do, are important. But let's not lay our hope on the law. Let's lay our hope into one another. This is why Jesus of Nazareth didn't call for a Roman emperor overturned or the Roman Empire to be thrown out. He knew the problem was deeper than that. He knew if he changed by a revolution of love, the hearts of people, regardless of their religious background, regardless of their ethnic background, if we change the hearts, then the people will change the laws and change the emperors and change the kings. So this is where we must begin while we go to City Hall. But let's not lose scope and hope upon these basic fundamental values. The Confederate flag is down. Is it where it should be? That's a matter of continuous debate. But at least it's no longer over the Capitol dome that should represent all the people of South Carolina. This is just one among many issues that we should all be involved in. But when we stand strong, regardless of the issue, I remind you to stand with love and tenderness and compassion, but with conviction and firmness of that which is good and should always be right. And so, glad to have you down here. I hope you understand our language system down here. You got one of the best here, and Tom, he and I have been friends a long time, and Mia, whom you, I assume, are just getting to know, and a lot of the guys, her dad and I were friends from a way back. We walked the streets in some of the rural towns in South Carolina on many occasions together back in the 70s and the 80s. So, Tom, thank you for all you're doing. Mayor, thank you for letting me be with you. IS, it's always good to see you, brother.
Thank you.
God bless all of you. Thank you.